Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mickey Connolly and I am with Conversant and here also with our provocative, entertaining, and insightful friend, Martin Lindstrom. So Martin, welcome your provocateur self.
Thank you, Mickey. It's an honor to be with you.
You know, we will have a very rapidly moving, slightly less than half an hour together. So I want to jump right in. And something that's been on my mind is, I've watched your publishing history over, I don't know, 20 years. And so many of your titles are overtly at the notion of brand and why people buy things. So if you look at brand sense and biology and even what you did one on branding for children, brand child, small data, brand washed, how we get manipulated into buying things. And now this seems like a major shift that you've gone from all of this made you famous study of the power of brand to getting your attention on the transformation of culture. What happened? How did you go from brand maven to saying, what I want to work on is altering the cultures and business practices inside of organizations? What happened?
That's a good question. Well, I tend to say that one's destination is never a place, but a new way of seeing things. And if I should draw up my life and I put brand in the middle, I learned two things. And this is really good advice for everyone which wanted to somehow build your own personal brand, because that's what I did along the way. I could not 25 years ago claim I was the #1 branding guy in the world because I didn't have the credibility to do that. So what I decided to do was to explore aspects in the periphery of that concept. So first I went online, and that was in 1994, the very year the World Wide Web was invented, and talked about how to build brands online. And then I talked about ethics. And then I went on and I talked about neuroscience. And then I started to talk about small data, which were all about consumer insight and deep insight. And then I went on again and I said, well, listen, it could be kind of interesting if I could go even further and discuss issues like the census. And what I realized through this whole journey into my life was that that's all good, Martin. But what about the people? What about the people creating organizations? And time after time, I realized that when I worked with people, they actually were the ones making this become real. And that's, of course, where culture comes into play. So it's been a journey for me. And it's a journey where I'm starting to see the world from multiple points of views. And what I've learned is if you really want to make a powerful brand or a powerful transformation in an organization, what you have to do is you have to ensure that you get people with you so they feel part of that journey. They feel an ownership, because some of the companies both you and I work with have more than 100,000 staff. Well, that's 100,000 employees, but also 100,000 ambassadors, right? And I think these ambassadors in many ways can be incredibly powerful in order to transform a brand. So really, it's just me waking up and learning along the way. And that's the reason why.
Well, it's good to hear that you, as accomplished as you are still waking up and learning along the way.
I tell you.
Now I want to go directly to the Ministry of Common Sense. One of the things I was really touched by in there is you've really taken a word with great sober concern that a lot of time people hear that word and it sounds soft. So I'm wondering, what is the relationship between empathy and taking all of this thoughtless waste out of organizations?
A really good question. And I think the best way for me to illustrate that is to understand what is empathy. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person and see, and this is important, feel what that person is feeling. And I think the first time I realized that was when I spent time with the founder and the owner of IKEA, the late Ingvar Kamprad, where I went to his office in Sweden many years ago, and he was not there for our meetings. I said, where is he? And guess what? He was actually down at the cash register. And I said to him during the break, why did you sit there and check every customer out? He said, I'm doing that so I can see what they're feeling and I can hear what they're thinking. And that's the reason why IKEA is what it is today. And that's really what I learned from. And then later on, I had this amazing experience with the owner of Ferrari Chocolate, which is the largest or the richest, most wealthy person in Italy. He has this conglomerate of chocolate. And I remember he approached me some years into the success of the company, and he asked me to meet up with him in Napoli, in Italy. And I remember, this is a serious guy. He was so serious, he had a convoy of 6 limousines coming with him, and each of them had bodyguards inside. So they would step out of these cars and stand there, really seriously intimidating. And Mr. Ferrari came first, and he came up to me and he said to me, "Mr. Lindstrom, you had some advice for me." And I was a bit nervous, I had to admit, Mickey, because I mean, this is seriously intimidating in Napoli, of all places, with all the mafia. So I said, "Yeah, Mr. Ferrari, do me a favor, follow me and my advice." And then I took this convoy of him and the 6 bodyguards. We went into this little kiosk, and I'll show you what I did. And just look at this. My microphone can't catch my voice here, but take a look at this. So I went down on all 4 like this, right? And then I crawled on the floor like this, right? And Mr. Ferrari went down on all 4, and so did his 6 bodyguards, okay? We're crawling like this. And then I reached for the shelf. And I said, "I can't reach your product. Can you reach your product?" And Mr. Ferrari, he was 72 years at that stage. He said, "No, I can't reach my product." I said, "That's my advice to you." And that is really the concept of empathy. It is to see the world through the customer's point of view. And I think what's happening is, increasingly as we grow as an organization, what happens is that we forget about who's paying our salary, and we start to see the world from inside out rather than outside in. And what happens is that empathy fades out, and there's a direct correlation between empathy and common sense. Remember, common sense is to see things as they are and do things as they ought to be done. Or said in another way, it is to treat customers and employees as they themselves would expect to be treated. And we've forgotten about that. We are so busy thinking about ourselves, our own little silo, our own little KPIs, that empathy dies. And that's where we as a brand and as a company are dying as well, including the culture, right?
That's beautiful. So you just reminded me of, there's a place in the book I really enjoy where you're talking about Alfred Hitchcock's difference between his blue script and his green script. And I thought that's interesting for very senior leaders to think about. Can you say what that has to do with the whole world of empathy?
Well, Alfred Hitchcock, when he developed his movies, he always worked with 2 manuscripts. In fact, this is not public knowledge before this book was released. He had the blue script and the green script. The blue script was the rational script. It's the props, it's the monologue, it's the dialogue, it's all the stuff you can see. The green script is how you should feel. And he literally, minute by minute, will map out how you, as a viewer or as an audience, should feel throughout the entire journey. Here you feel a sense of empathy. Here you feel scared. Here you feel joy. And that was his secret. And the reason why I'm discussing this a lot is because when you as a business leader are working with organizations, I think we're really, really good at working on the blue script level. And that is, by the way, directly correlated with Wall Street, the quarterly announcement earnings, all the rational stuff. But what about the green script? How should people feel throughout this entire journey? One of the things I always do is to map down not just how customers should feel minute by minute throughout all these different touch points, but also is to go inside. And you and I have worked a lot on that, to say, how do you map a green script inside the organization from the onboarding moment to when people are going up in the hierarchy or whatever they are. And it's funny because in half an hour from now on, I'll talk to Hubert Joly, which is the former CEO of Best Buy, and the guy which increased the share price from $11 to $80 in his doing his time at Best Buy. And one of the things he is going to probably say on our live show in half an hour from now is that he always sat down with his staff and asked them, "What is your dream?" And they literally would do that scenario with all the 188,000 staff. So they will have 188,000 dreams, and they will fulfill it throughout the whole process. And suddenly people never really went to work. They actually just were fulfilling their dream, which I think is an amazing way of executing a green script.
Wow. Now I want to move to something that's, to me, simultaneously profound and practical. So my admired colleague and global partner and conversant, Anne Marie Allen, says, if you want to understand great performance, follow the joy. And what's interesting is when she taught us over the years about how you do that, you start to map out who interacts with whom in order to produce this great achievement. And we found out that most of the time they were doing workarounds, the bureaucracy, the current processes and structures. And somehow they had to do that in order to enjoy producing these brilliant results. Well, I see in some of the stories you're telling in the book, you've done very similar kind of research where you get in there and discover that in order to be great, people are circumventing, pardon me, this is your words, the bullshit in the system. So I just want to know, what have you learned about how to simultaneously honor great performance and reveal the waste?
A lot. What I've learned as point number one is that in our world today, we do not have patience anymore. We are driven by the quarterly announcement earnings. And because of that, nothing can happen if it takes for years and years to do. And I know that you and I are very aligned around the philosophy of setting aside 3 months or 90 days to create a change, or as you call it, an intervention in an organization. So here's what I tend to do. I first of all spend time, it depends on how we start the assignment, but if I start an assignment where I have a good contact with the CEO, I tend to get a mandate from the CEO, but the mandate is not defined. It's something like, if I find a good initiative down there, will you support me? And of course, always the answer is yes. Then I take the express elevator and I go straight back to the ground. And here's what I'm doing, which is really important. I spend time with people on the ground to learn about their life, to see the world through their point of view. Now, this is so important because not only will it help you later on to frame your messages at the town hall, quite often you see the world view from a shareholder or investor's point of view, but if you see it from an employee's point of view, you actually are able to sell things through the organization much quicker, in my opinion. But the second thing I always do is to find out where are the frictions and what frictions has been down there, which really frustrates people to an extreme degree. And then I find the person which have the capability at a low level to change it. And I say to the person, and this is true stories, I say to the person, hey, let's change it. And the person will immediately say to me, you know what? It's a waste of time. I've been here for 17 years. There's no way I can make a change happen. I tried it 5 times. It failed every time. I say, do you want to bet? And then I go up in my express elevator to the top and I say, hey, we have Mr. Smith down there. He has an idea. Fine, go ahead. Go down again, say, let's go ahead. And then we work on it for a couple of months and we immediately implement a little change. And here's the advice. It has to be a little change which have a profound impact, which costs nothing. That is the trick, okay? Once you have that little change happening, you celebrate the hell out of it. You talk to everyone about it. And of course, Mr. Smith is so proud, and so he should be. But then it gives hopes to everyone else. And I want to illustrate that in a different way. So if I go back to my little drawing for a second, remember one thing, Mickey, and I know you and I are so aligned around this. There was an experiment done with chickens. They're put into a cage for half a year, and one day they were let out on the beautiful green grass. Guess what? They went straight out to the grass and back in again after 30 seconds. I call that the chicken cage syndrome. But the issue is, how do you get the chickens out? How do you do a change, a behavioral change in the organization? Well, if you imagine you have 4 chicken cages standing and you're seeing them from the top. So now they're standing in a square, and I'll be very nice to the chickens. I'm going to open the doors here. And where would you place the corn? And I think most business leaders will say, well, this is clever. I'm going to place it in the middle. No, you're not going to place it in the middle, because here's what's going to happen. Chicken 1 is now going to look out and say, that's a wonderful corn. My God, it's far away. My KPIs are not supporting me going that far because that's really far. And by the way, that manager asking me to go that far, I wonder if he will be fired soon. And then I'll stand there like an idiot. So what are you going to do as chicken 1? You're looking at chicken 2. And chicken 2 is now looking at chicken 3. And chicken 3 is looking at chicken 4. And what are they going to do? They're going to conclude that's too far away. So they're going to go straight back in again. So what have I learned? I learned you always have to place the corn straight outside the chicken cage. Why is that? Because if chicken A takes that one, everyone else will look at it and say, my God, that looks delicious, that corn. I'm prepared to do the same. And then all of them will take it. And suddenly you actually can have that movie going on. And that's what you call 90-day interventions. But it's also what I believe is a way of celebrating a behavioral change in an organization. And once that happens, you cement that change. And I think that's the biggest mistake for everyone today. They believe once you've given instructions or whatever you're doing, that it stays permanent. No, it doesn't. It's like spinning plates in a cinema or in a circus. You spin that plate, and then fall apart behind you. And that's what's so important about transformation of organization. You should not believe the result is when you implement it. That's first where the job begins, to maintain it and grow it throughout the organization, right?
Well, the idea of helping people with the wins, the early wins, the ones that are accessible and yet still surprising and gratifying. You, in the book, you talk in great detail about designing those and how you do that. And we'll be sending all of you a link to the Ministry of Common Sense so you can get it for yourself, because in there, you are very practical in explaining what you've learned about how this works. I want to ask something, though, about the particular disposition of a senior executive who's really working on the Ministry of Common Sense. Because everybody I know, if you say, would you like to take thoughtless waste out of your organization to get more things done with less time, money, and stress? Why, certainly, Mr. Lindstrom, certainly I'd like to do that. Well, how come everybody agrees with that intellectually, and yet so many senior executives fail to sponsor that actually happening? Conversely, what's the nature of the CEO who does get it to happen?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And the answer is not straightforward. So first of all, the Ministry of Common Sense, as you know, but perhaps no one knows on this call, exists. And it exists because we built it up in Standard Chartered Bank, which is a shared client of ours. Standard Chartered Bank is one of the leading banks around. They have 88,000 staff, and they had, as any other bank, have a lot of frictions going on. I mean, when you're operating in a compliance-based industry, there is a lot of red tape going on. So this wonderful lady, her name is Gail, to whom, by the way, I also dedicated the book, comes up with this Ministry of Common Sense in one of my workshops. And she says, listen, I want to remove one friction at a time. And here's what she's doing. This is a fantastic story. Listen to this. Gail says, I want to understand why things take a long time. So they had one procedure, for example, to get, I don't know, if it was a loan or whatever it was, but something. And she says, listen, I want to streamline that. Why does it take eight days to have this approval going through our system? I don't understand it. So she becomes the case. Listen to this. She decides to become the case. So she walks around with this piece of paper as it was emailed, but now she's physically walking around instead to all the desks where she needs the signatures, and it has to go down there and up there and down there. And she spends 8 days on doing it. And after the 8 days, she realizes, do you know what? All these signatures are BS. You don't need that signature. You don't need that. That person never looked at the document. By the way, that person didn't understand it. That person was just like, ridiculous. So she reduces it to 6 hours. I'm not kidding, 6 hours. And they turn it around so quickly. The clients come back to them and say, you haven't looked at our case. You can't do that in 6 hours. That's impossible. And actually they had. And this is a matter about seeing the world from a customer's point of view, or in this case, to see it from a case point of view. So what we learned is 2 things from this. The first thing is the ministry was set up 3 years ago. It's been a tremendous success and is now running in 7 companies across the world, by the way. But what happened during this process is, number one, it was self-retained. This is crazy. We set up a website. We asked people to submit all these things, okay? People submitted the complaints or issues or frictions or whatever in the hundreds, if not the thousands, and then they attached a solution to it. Wonderful. So we were just like an intermediary in the end of the day. And the solutions were quite often very, very straightforward. I mean, I'll give you an example. At Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world, it sits on 21% of all trade in the world. We introduced a very simple idea. Why don't we kill PowerPoint presentations? You can imagine the screams going on, right? We learned from that process that we reduced productivity or we increased productivity more than 20% because people are not using this. It's just like BS, right? But going back to Gail, the first thing we did was to clean up one stupidity at a time. What happened was, once it happened, everyone else, metaphorically speaking, the chickens, looked and said, my God, that's really smart. I actually have frictions too. And the reason why they stepped out of the cage was because the ramifications were not very high. I mean, I don't want to say to my boss, you're stupid, but if I can go through this intermediate, which can help me to solve my problems and make a solution out of it, it actually works. The second thing we learned was, in organizations, you probably will find 2% doers. And I'm not saying more than 2%. These are people within the organization which are taking this, and you know when you give this assignment to them, it will happen. For sure, I give it to that person, I know it's a guarantee it will happen. Only 2% in companies, to our estimate, are true doers. Make sure they get it first. And once they get it, they will create the internal movement, the domino effect. And then suddenly you actually scale it. So as you can hear, Mickey, my answer is not straightforward, as you know. We talk about culture, we talk about politics, bureaucracy, compliance. But in the end of the day, it's a matter about seeing the world from another point of view, which is empathy.
Well, I think the capacity for a senior leader to use her or his position power to sponsor these unusual early victories is really important. And I guess on Bill Winter's part, he had to have some empathy for Gail coming to him and wanting to do this.
He had, listen, Bill, he was and slash is extraordinary good, because he was the first CEO which broke with how one behaves within a bank of that size, where he broke down barriers. You know, he was picking up his coffee himself from the canteen. He was seen in the special elevator. No, he was not seen in the special elevator anymore. There's all these different things where people say, my God, he's down to earth. So it's in Bill's spirit to do these things. And then when I talk to people about it, they say, yeah, that's typical Bill to support that. But I have to say, to his credit and everyone's credit which have done this, it is profoundly impactful. And if I go back to Maersk, I mean, Maersk would have around 90,000 staff, and would started to, where we took the customers with us into the offices and started to understand the reality, it really changed things. And Mika, I want to tell you a story about this because it's so fascinating. So I'm going to introduce a new word for all of you guys out there. You never heard the word before. I guarantee you. The word is rolling. Rolling is a word used in the shipping industry. And it basically means if you ship a container from destination A to B, the container will be standing at the pier in the harbor and may be skipped because someone else is paying a higher fee for another container. So if you're unlucky, it can be there for a couple of weeks. Between 30 and 40% of all containers in the world are rolled every week. So if you're selling flowers from Colombia, it's not a good deal. So I said to Maersk, do you know what, guys? That's ridiculous. No, it's just not acceptable. And they looked at me and they said, yes, it is. It's pretty cool because we are 5% better. So we're doing less rolling than everyone else, which is 30% then, right? I said, we have to change it. And I could not convince them to see the world otherwise. Remember, they invented container shipping. It's always been like that. So I said to them, here's what I'm going to do. This is the trick. Everyone listen, super important. When people are stuck in the chicken cage, you have to simulate them changing the point of view 180 degrees, because sometimes you can't drag them out. So here's what you do. You do a projection technique. And the projection technique is very simple. You say, what company do you aspire to outside your industry? And in their case, they really liked Uber. I said, fantastic. I'm going to do a little scenario now. What would happen if Maersk bought Uber? It's not Uber buying Maersk, but Maersk bought Uber. And then I had them simulate 88,000 people simulating what would happen. And there was these ridiculous scenarios about you taking an Uber and halfway through, you'll be kicked out of the Uber because someone else is paying more, right, on that trip. And suddenly they got it. They said, gosh, you're right. And that went to the global integrated strategy, which we implemented later on. And the result of that was that for the first time in history, in shipping, you now have from destination A to B, one click, and you will not be kicked off. And Maersk was the first to introduce that. And it sounds super easy from an outside-in point of view, but it's not when you lived in that immune system for that long time. And I'm proud to say 2 years later, and of course it's not my fault, all of it, but 2 years later, the share price for Maersk has tripled in 1 year. And that gives you a sense of when you adopt the empathy thing, and if the management is willing to give it a go, then suddenly it is extraordinarily powerful.
Beautiful. We've only got a couple minutes left, so I want to throw in one other question. Dean Myers, a few minutes ago, raised the issue that agility is not always rewarded. So what is it, if you don't have a CEO like some of the ones you're talking about who have been really aggressive, supportive sponsors, how does somebody create the notion of the Ministry of Common Sense, or the first high-performing exercise that could lead to it? What's the case to be made that cracks this? That's not the way we do it around here. We don't reward agility. What do you have to connect with to bring senior leadership along?
You go under the radar. You don't tell anyone about it, because here's the issue. You cannot communicate a success before success. You can come up with all sorts of spreadsheets, but they're predicting the past, not the future, right? So what I tend to say is, if there is a bunch of people which really have an idea, do it this way. And I'll give you a very concrete example. So one of our clients is one of the largest pharma clients around. They are the biggest player in the respiratory disease issue. And as I spent time with them, they said, hey, we really don't understand our patients. And that was a little outbreaker group in this pharma company saying it. So here's what I did. I said to them, let's go into patients and spend time with them. So we did that, this little group. And in one of these visits, I was in a room with a 28-year-old lovely girl. She had asthma, and she'd had asthma her entire life. And I said to her, how did it feel to have asthma when you were a child? And she started to cry. And I said to her, what happened? She said, I was teased, I was bullied, I was not invited to the parties, I was a disgrace for human mankind, is a quote, and it was really hard. I said, but listen, you look like you're very confident today, what changed? And she took her handbag, she brought up her handbag, and she pulled out a straw. And she said, this one here, whenever I meet people today, I give them a straw and I ask them to hold themselves from the nose and breathe through the straw. And then immediately they feel what I feel. That's an exchange of empathy. Now, we did this in secrecy. No one knew that at senior management. And here's what we did then. We then went one step further and we said, hey, I want to do a little experiment at the board level. So we took that straw, we switched off the light, we have all senior executives breathe through a straw. And after 30 seconds, one executive, he spits out the straw and he said, this is ridiculous. No one can live like this. And I said, except the fact that this is how your patients feel like every minute of their entire life. And you could almost feel a penny drop on the floor. And they started to employ people through the lens of empathy. They did R&D through empathy. But the most important thing was we created an exchange of empathy. So here's my advice. Whether you can do that or not, try to do an experiment under the radar. Make sure you get a little bit of an evidence out of it. Once you have that, build the case, then communicate it in whatever format it is. Don't go straight up and get permission, because you'll never get it.
Beautiful. I am sorry to say we are at the end of our time in today's conversation. I do want everybody to know that we're giving everything that's come up in the chat to Martin, and the recording will come out to all of you, plus everybody who registered for the conversation who couldn't actually be here today. And Martin will have an opportunity to respond to some of those questions. Martin, thank you so much. I'm just looking at everybody's reactions to this today, and I think it's been beautifully productive. So anything you want to say to all of us in closing?
Listen, I want to say a very simple thing. I think it was Benjamin Franklin, which once said that common sense is something that everyone needs, okay? Few have and no one think they lack. In my opinion, common sense is not that common. So do me a favor. Let's fight to get it back. It's not just fun. It's extraordinarily important in a time where empathy is in a collapse, and with that, common sense is disappearing from our lives.
Beautiful. Thank you, my friend.
Pleasure.
An insightful and provocative pleasure.
Thank you so much. Likewise.